One brief final announcement there are questions are still being accepted. So if you get your final question into that basket back where Randy's standing, it might make the Q&A. What does God command Christians to do when they gather together on the Lord's Day? What does God command Christians to do when they gather together on the Lord's Day? This was a question that I was asking when I was studying at Westminster, and Carl Trueman was kind enough to allow me to do a study with him in the Reformation era to answer this question and to try to understand what the Reformed tradition is called the regulative principle of worship, where God's word is read aloud and preached and prayed and sung and seen in the ordinances during the gathering. And yet, here we are today with 7,387 languages in the world. And 710 of those have a Bible in their language, translated in a language they understand. Friends, that's less than 10% of the world's languages have a copy of God's Word. And yet in these Reformed confessions, 39 articles, Irish articles, Westminster Confession, Second London Confession, we find statements about the need for translating God's Word into the common language so that prayers and preaching and the reading of the Word and the singing of the Word and the ordinances are understood, are intelligible to the Christians gathering together. Bible Translation Fellowship seeks to try to integrate Bible translation with what the church is called to do in its gathering. I would encourage you to stop by our table and back. If you think it's gimmicky to have stickers and bookmarks, I say, sure, it's gimmicky. But all I'm asking you to do is to use this as a reminder to stick in your Bible, to stick on your water bottle, and to pray. As Paul said in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 1, pray for us that the word of the Lord would run rapidly and be glorified. So this serves merely as a purpose to remind God's people to pray that he would raise up laborers to send into his harvest to work on those 90% of the languages of the world where God's word still needs to be translated. Please pray for God to do that. And please welcome Carl. Thank you for your labors here.
It's good to be back. It's always, the great thing about speaking at conferences with other people is you can generally avoid having to do the talk straight after lunch. When you're the only guy speaking, you have a lot of choice. So I hope that I can stay awake longer than you can, because it will be more obvious if I fall asleep. Want to just wrap up the second lecture. I was falling a little bit behind by summarizing sort of what we've done so far. What I want to suggest is we now live in a world where we are all plastic people, where our identity, or certainly the way we imagine our identities to be, is fundamentally plastic. We are able to determine our own identities, at least as far as we are concerned, in a way that is remarkably plastic, remarkably malleable compared to previous generations. So that's the sort of the plastic people side of things. And to boil that down to a single point from what I've said so far is that the idea that our identity is given to us externally by institutions, by the world around us, is something that we now find oppressive and implausible. Secondly, we live in a liquid world. That the world, if we were to go back to the Middle Ages, the world would have been a very static, stable world. You would probably have been born, baptized, you would have been baptized, married, and buried in the same church. You would have been born and lived your life probably within 20 miles of your birthplace. You would probably have met the person you were going to marry by the time you were 10 years old. Now we live in a much more liquid world, a world where these things no longer apply, where the world is much more changeable, and that connects to that plasticity of the self in a way that further accentuates and intensifies the fluidity, the instability of our identities. And I would also add to this a third point that sort of derives from what I've been saying so far, and that is, in this world, we are now finding that suddenly old self-evident social values come to be seen as vices. As the world is transformed by this psychological self, as the idea of ourselves as being fundamentally plastic and the world as being liquid in some way comes to grip our imaginations, the old social values come to be seen as problems. And I would just flag up two at this point. I mentioned in the earlier class, in the earlier lecture, the First Amendment. The First Amendment, of course, protects both freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And in the world of 1776, in the world of the American founding, those were both considered to be good things. Thomas Jefferson's famous statement in his notes on the state of Virginia, that what does it matter to me if my neighbor believes in one God or 20 gods or no God at all? It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. That's a wonderful way of capturing something of the essence of Jefferson's thought on freedom of religion. And the point he's making there, of course, is it doesn't really matter what theological opinions my neighbors have, whether they're theists, atheists, Christians, Jewish, whatever. It doesn't really matter because it doesn't damage me physically and it doesn't damage me financially. And if we were to sort of feed that back into the two lectures from this morning, I would say Jefferson says that in a world where harm is understood in terms of harm to property, person, finances. And underlying that, of course, is a certain notion of selfhood that is intimately connected to those things. When you shift to a world where the self is primarily understood in terms of feelings and psychology, harm is transformed. It may not pick your pocket or break your leg, but if it makes you feel bad, then it's harmed you. And that's not to trivialize it. I don't want to say that that's a trivial thing. We all know that words can hurt terribly badly. And in a world where the dominant understanding of what it is to be a person, where we conceive of happiness and fulfillment in psychological terms, then those things that interfere with that are harmful. Hence, words become weapons. Even silence in certain circumstances can be described as violence. So all of this is to say this shifting understanding of the self is now calling into question things that even 20 years ago would have been regarded as unqualified goods. Freedom of speech on campus, for example, freedom of religion. Those freedoms work as virtues in a world where the dominant understanding of the self and of fulfillment is not a psychologized one. But that's no longer our world. And that's why some of the strange dynamics, or what appear to people of my generation and older, strange dynamics of what would have been regarded once as unquestioned truths or virtues, are being challenged and coming into play at this point. So, to conclude then these first two sort of analytical lectures, I want to say this: the sexual revolution and its various details cannot be treated in isolation. What we see and what we witness relative to LGBTQ plus stuff in our society is not a sort of unique and odd phenomenon in our wider society. It's actually one function of underlying pathologies or aspects of the culture in which we now live in. And it's not caused by one thing. It's caused by, if you like, the perfect storm of a number of factors coming together. Intellectual factors, cultural factors, technological factors, all combining to shape our thinking in this way. And that means, of course, that when we think about how do we respond to this, which is where we're going to move momentarily, there is no single idea or single argument or silver bullet. If you come to this conference thinking, well, great, now Trueman's going to give us the answer. No. Trueman's going to give you just probably a bit more of the problem in some ways. But I think it's helpful for us to realize there's no single answer to this, because I think it helps us chasten our expectations. It is certainly good to get the right public officials elected. It's certainly good to get the right people appointed to positions of authority in our land, whether legal or political. But a majority on the Supreme Court's not going to solve the problem. Way back in 2015, the magazine I write for, First Things, it's a conservative religious magazine, in the run-up to the Obergefell v. Hodges decision, it wanted on the day of the decision to have a series of responses. But of course, you can't just write a response on the day. So what the editor did was he asked a number of us write 2 responses. One if it goes one way, one if it goes the other way. Essentially, depending on how Anthony Kennedy votes, we want your response. And I sent in my 2 articles, my copy, and the editor dropped back and said, I like your articles, but I've noticed there's only 1 sentence difference between the 2 of them. And that was the opening sentence. You're saying what the decision had been. And I said, yeah, and that was intentional. Because I actually think that the Supreme Court decision may well alter how things play out legally in the short to medium term. But the underlying cultural trends will not be significantly affected by the Supreme Court decision. That raises legal questions, but the culture remains in place. The culture is still flowing strongly in one direction. That's where we are. And that's why I think, but as Christians, as conservative religious people, we can't just think about, okay, what's the argument we need to win here? We have to think about a whole variety of things. If you like, if the causes of the problem are as comprehensive as I suggest they are, then the solution to the problem has to be equally comprehensive. And that's then, if we could move then to lecture 3 on the slides, that would be great. By the way, I want to give a personal thank you to all of the people who've worked behind the scenes to make the conference possible. From the women manning the coffee and providing the catering downstairs, to the guys in the sound booth at the back, and the people manning the bookstores. Conferences like this can't take place without an awful lot of people giving their time for nothing. And I'm very grateful to all of you for making it possible. Third lecture, Tale of Two Cities. You see, I've introduced some pictures at this point. This is because this is a lecture I give to the students at Grove at the end of one of my courses. It's a sort of combination of a couple of lectures I give to them. As we're sending them off into the wider world, what are the last thoughts I want to send them with? And this lecture sort of captures some of those. Tale of Two Cities. Think about our current moment. What would characterize our current moment? Step outside church for the moment and think about society in general. Polarized politics. The almost complete breakdown of political discourse in this country. The president of Grove City College, President Paul McNulty, is a wonderful man. I have to say that because he employs me, but he is a wonderful man anyway. He was Deputy Attorney General under George W. Bush, and was elected to that position, I believe, by a unanimous vote of the Senate in around about 2005. For younger people in the audience, we may have to explain that term, unanimous vote of the Senate. You may not be familiar with it. That's remarkable, isn't it? Can we imagine today any candidate from either party getting a unanimous vote of confirmation on anything? That's not a partisan point, that's a cultural point. Our culture is profoundly politically polarized. It's fragmented. The loss of what I call a meta-narrative here. There is no bigger narrative that binds things together. I talked yesterday at the pastor's seminar about the term un-American, that when I came to America in 2001 was always being used on the news. And it struck me as rather odd because we have no British equivalent. To say something is un-English sounds kind of humorous and ironic. It doesn't mean anything in English, but un-American was a term that was used. Don't hear it very much now. And I don't think I hear it very much because the very notion of what is an American is no longer something upon which Americans have a consensus. No longer something upon which Americans have a consensus. I'm an immigrant. I'm not an American. I'm a green card holder. I love living in America. America's been very good to me and my family. I'm grateful to be here. I'm shocked at the number of Americans who seem very ungrateful to be in America. And that witnesses to me of a loss of national meta-narrative. I remember being very struck when I was first in America in 1996, and we were in Grand Rapids, and a friend said, let's go to the powwow this afternoon. And there was a Native American gathering. And my friend and I and my wife and family, we went along to it. And I was struck that this Native American gathering was the homecoming of the 7 tribes or something. How at some point during that gathering, all of the Native Americans were there, stood and saluted the flag and sang the national anthem. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. That here we have a very distinct culture, and yet all of these people feel they belong to something bigger than just their immediate culture. I think that's gone from America now. I think that meta-narrative has vanished. I think there are new narratives of identity replacing that, those that I talked about. Particularly I talked about sexual narratives, I suppose, but we could add racial and ethnic narratives to those. And again, that's not a criticism of those narratives on that point. I'm saying when you get a vacuum of identity, other identities will emerge to fill the void because people want to know who they are. They want to belong to a meta-narrative. They want to belong to a community. They want to be recognized. It's not enough to be free. We want to be recognized. And I think it's particularly affected evangelical Protestantism. Evangelical Protestants, I think at the moment, seem particularly angry. And I asked a Catholic friend of this. I said, are you experiencing the same feeling of anger in Catholicism that I see in a lot of Protestantism in America? And he said, not really. And I said, why do you think that is? And he said, we never thought we owned the country. So although we're sad about what's going on, he said, we don't feel something's been stolen from us. I think a lot of evangelical Protestants feel something's been stolen from them. That makes them very angry. Others, like Roman Catholics or perhaps Jewish community, always feel they've been marginalized, and so as distressed as they are with some of the changes taking place, there isn't quite the same anger that charges discussions. And the question then becomes, I think, for us, how does the church relate to the state, the culture, and the world? This is the question I want to address in this final lecture. And I can do no more in this lecture than offer some of my own personal thoughts. And a somewhat less than comprehensive picture. Having said we need a comprehensive solution, I can't possibly give that in the space of 35, 40 minutes. But here are some thoughts on it. So small I can hardly read it myself at this point. But I think Christians are perennially pulled in 2 directions. We are pulled in the direction, I'm trying to read that, to spiritualize the good, to spiritualize good things, and so to be kind of heavenly minded. On the other hand, there's the direction that pulls us into placing our sort of ultimate hope in the things of this world. And I think the key thing for Christians today is we have to, how do we strike a balance, if you like, between what one might call the earthly city and the heavenly city? How do we navigate our way at this point, given the various things that are in play for us? And that's where I want to reflect on the work of this man, Augustine. Augustine is an interesting figure. He's a late 4th century, early 5th century writer. In the history of Christian thought, there is no writer outside of the biblical writers more important than Augustine. Certainly in the West, whether you're a Protestant or a Catholic, your thought will track back to Augustine at some deep and profound level. And there is not an area of Christian truth or Christian concern where Augustine does not have something to say, or where he does not say something that has important implications for that area. His major works, the Confessions. I used to joke in class at Westminster when I taught there, if you haven't read the Confessions, then frankly I don't consider your Christian testimony to be credible. Go away and read it. It's an amazing reflection upon his move from paganism to Christianity. His work on the Trinity remains one of the classic works on the doctrine of God. And perhaps towering above them all is his work, The City of God. It's about 1,000 pages in the Latin translation. It would be about 600 pages in the original Latin text. It is a massive reflection upon the relationship between the earthly city and the city of God, we might say, between earth and heaven, and how the church is to navigate or negotiate its relationship between those two realities. And it's written in a particularly pertinent moment of time. And I think it's written at a moment in time that has close analogies with the world in which we live today. Now, obviously, it's the 5th century, so the analogies are not tight and close on every point. But I think there are some broad similarities between the challenges the Church of Augustine's day is facing and the challenges we are facing today. The 4th century, in some ways the most remarkable century in the history of the entire church, is the century where the Roman Empire rapidly Christianizes. Christianity has moved from being a marginal Jewish sect at the end of the 1st century. So by the time we reach the beginning of the 4th century, the dominant cultural and perhaps the most powerful administrative force within the Roman Empire. And what happens is that the Roman Empire Christianizes. First of all, Christianity is tolerated, and then by the end of the 4th century, it is the official religion. Now, the Roman Empire, think about the Roman Empire, stunningly successful. Really from the 3rd century BC onwards, Rome is a rising and then dominant force within Europe, and its empire will ultimately spread to a vast geographical area. When Carthage falls in the 2nd century, the only other political power that could rival Rome is crushed. And there's this moving scene when Scipio Africanus, the Roman general who'd led the charge against Carthage and destroyed it, he stands on a hill looking down on Carthage as the city is razed to the ground, as the Romans burned it. And he weeps. And one of his aides turns to him and asks him why he's weeping. And he says, because this will happen to Rome. One day this will happen to Rome. Well, many centuries pass. But in 410, it sort of does happen to Rome. But think about that. Rome was a dominant empire for 600 or 700 years. America as a constitutional nation has only existed for just over 200 years. And yet Rome was dominant, I'm going to say, for the best part of a millennium. That's a remarkable historical and cultural achievement, political achievement. There is no real rival to Rome in the history of mankind as a superpower. There just isn't. And Rome was known as the Eternal City. If you've never been to Rome, it's my wife and I love Rome. It's one of the best, most beautiful cities in the world. I don't know how Italy operates. The only people who seem to work are waiters and chefs, but their waiters are fantastic and the chefs are to die for. Oh dear. Put it up here. There you go. Rome was the Eternal City. And then in 410 it falls. It falls to Alaric the Goth. And the dirty Goths overrun Rome. And that's a massive psychological blow. This city that has been dominant for 700 years is overrun. I don't know if you've ever watched that movie, The Untouchables, with Sean Connery. And there's that sort of sad bit in the middle where one of the guys is machine gunned and killed. I think it's in an elevator. And they write over him, the gangsters write over him, touchable. Making the point that you think you're invulnerable, but we've hit you right where it hurts. Rome thought it was untouchable, and it falls. And this precipitates a reaction. There's a pagan reaction. The pagan reaction is, this is what happens when you abandon the old gods. Rome has abandoned the old gods. It's turned to Christianity, and the Christian God has proved impotent to help. The Christian reaction, of course, is also one of crisis. The triumph of Christianity and the eternality of Rome had come to be sort of one and the same thing in the mindset of Roman Christians. And Roman refugees flee. They flee from Italy and they flee across the Mediterranean to North Africa. And many of them flood into the town of Hippo Regius, where Augustine, the great writer and intellectual, is also the bishop. He's the local church leader and administrator. And it's in this context that he writes the City of God, because he's faced with a twofold problem, and therefore has a twofold purpose in writing this. He's got to write an apologetic piece. He's got to defend God in this context. He's got to refute the pagans and reassure the Christians that God's still in control. He has to do that. That's an apologetic thing. It's also pastoral. He's got to reassure the Christians. And he's got to really set in their minds, how do we understand the church relative to this wider culture? We might put it this way. How do we value Rome? How do we interact with Rome? How do we operate as good Roman citizens in a way that yet doesn't mean that we identify the purposes of God with the purposes of Rome, such that when Rome falls, God does not fall? How do we do that? And I think that's kind of the challenge Christians face today. There are a number of challenges that arise out of the stuff that I've been describing this morning. Some of them pastoral and some of them political, in the sense of how do we live within the polis? How do we live within the commonwealth or the nation? And that's where Augustine, I think, is particularly helpful to us. Now, the work is massive. It's not a book, I wouldn't say, hey, you've got 10 minutes, why don't you read Augustine's City of God? It's a major commitment. It's the kind of book that maybe you want to read a few chapters a day. And chapters are not long in these ancient books. They're more like sort of short, a couple of paragraphs. But maybe you want to read a couple of chapters a day. Or maybe you want to set yourself the goal of, I'm going to read the City of God over a year or over 2 years. I'm just going to grind through it. It's sometimes obscure. As with a lot of works, there are bits of this work where Augustine is refuting religions that have long since vanished. So he's refuting certain ancient Roman religions that have no relevance to us at all anymore. But it was important that he refuted them at the time. It's best read, though, I think, as a dramatic story. Really, Augustine is telling a story. And he's telling a story about the relationship between, the struggle between, the city of God and the city of man, or the earthly city, I think, is his preferred way of talking. We tend to think about city of man. Augustine, I think, used the term the earthly, the terrestrial city. How do these two things connect? And at the heart of it, if you read just one book of the city of God, read book 19, because that's where he gets to the heart of how Christians should relate to a broader pagan culture. And he asks in book 19, what is it that makes a people? We might translate that into modern terms and say, well, what is it that makes a nation? What is it that binds us together? What is it that binds people in Sacramento together with people in Maine, together with people in Florida? What is it that binds us together as a nation? And he goes to the ancient philosopher Cicero. Cicero died in the 1st century BC. He was an outspoken opponent of Julius Caesar and Caesar's adopted son Octavian, who became the Emperor Augustus, had Cicero proscribed. Put out a government-sanctioned hit on Cicero, and he was murdered. But he was a philosopher, and he wrestled long and hard with politics. And Cicero's definition of a people was this: society, a people, we might say a nation, is a collection of people committed to the notion of justice. That's Cicero's notion. But Augustine said, no, that's not adequate. Problem with that is that notions of justice and commitment to justice, that can vary among people. a more adequate understanding of what binds people together, a more adequate understanding is this. Society is made up of people who agree on things to love. It's our loves that shape who we are. And that, I think, is a key thing, because I think that this idea will be very helpful as we move into the future, navigating things like co-belligerence and attitude to the world around us. A people, Augustine says, is a multitude of rational beings joined together by common agreement on the objects of their love. And he quotes Jeremiah 29, verse 7. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. And what Augustine does with that passage is this. He says what the Lord is saying there is, the exiles are being sent into exile. They're going to be living in a hostile culture. And yet, as hostile as that culture is, there will be things they share in common with the citizens of that hostile culture. Things that they can agree on. Common things that they can work towards. And those things are defined by their love. There are common things that they will love together. Augustine says, there's a hierarchy of loves. At the top, Augustine would say for Christians, there's the love of God. And the love of God can be perfected only in heaven. And the love of God is not something that Christians share with pagans. That's unique to Christians. We are the ones who love God. Pagans are the ones who, they love other gods, or they hate the God of the Bible. But Augustine said, but that doesn't exhaust the definition of love. On earth, there are other loves. And Augustine cites a few. It's friendship. We love having friends. Many of us, hopefully all of us, have friends who aren't actually Christians. And yet we enjoy that friendship not as primarily perhaps as an evangelistic opportunity, but because we cherish the friendship we have. We enjoy the things we do together with our friends. Good wine. Is there anything more delightful than sitting on deck in the summertime, sharing time, drinking a glass of wine, or if you don't drink alcohol, drinking fruit juice or something, but spending good time with friends in a context where you can delight in each other's company. And then there are broader, one might call civic things that everybody loves. Peace and stability. Everybody wants to live in a peaceful and stable society. And Augustine says these are things that we share in common. Christians and pagans love these things. The difference, of course, Augustine was saying, is in how we love them. Your atheist friend may love the stability of the nation as an end in itself. That's all he's ultimately interested in, is stable, civilized society. He loves a good thing, but his loves sort of terminate there. Whereas a Christian, Augustine would say, loves a stable society, but there are greater loves than that. And a Christian might say, I love a stable society where there is freedom of religion precisely because I'm able to exercise my love of my God in ways that I wish to, on a Sunday, in church, etc., in the workplace. But what Augustine would say is important to grasp here is that love of stability is something we share with non-Christians. It's something we can stand shoulder to shoulder with non-Christians. And therefore, Augustine said that the way for Christians to think about life in the pagan world is this. It's not complete withdrawal from, nor total identification with the pagan world. It's a kind of critical appreciation of the pagan world, a critical relationship to the pagan world. That there are things, yes, we can share in common, we can agree with, we can stand shoulder to shoulder with people on. It's just that for us, they're not ultimate in the way they might be for our neighbors. And that brings us then to the question of something like, say, political co-belligerence. How should a Christian think about politics today? Well, one of the things I would say that makes our world a little more complicated than Augustine's, for reasons that really derive from my first two lectures, is that consensus probably isn't as strong today as it would have been in Augustine's day. I'm guessing that if you were in Augustine's day and you'd said, what does a stable society look like? Probably everybody would have had a similar idea. I think one of the problems we face today is that some of those things, like what does social stability look like, may look different to different people. So we live in a little more contested world than we used to. But I would suggest there are groups out there with whom we may profoundly disagree about the city of God, but with whom we might find profound agreement about the city of man. Christians, I think, and Jews, for example, might find great shared common cause on the issue of religious freedom, on the issue of what it means to live in a free society. I mentioned earlier on, I spent 2 days this week speaking at a conference organized by the Latter-day Saints. Would never have imagined doing that even 10 years ago. But I was happy to do that this week because I felt I did it without saying we share the same faith, but on the basis that I was able to say we share the same concerns. And that, for example, the same reading of the First Amendment is important for you as it is for me. And these are the things we need to know about it. So co-belligerence, I think, is helped by this. I mean, think about the things we share in common with other religiously conservative people. We all want our children protected from pornography. We all want our children protected from public crudity. It's very trendy in Christian circles to celebrate the death of civic religion at the moment. And then there's a sense in which, well, civic religion wasn't real Christianity. I know it was formalism and it was often hypocritical. But frankly, I'd rather live in a hypocritical society where kids can walk down the street without being confronted with pornography than a society that thinks pornography is okay. At least a hypocritical civic religion society had the decency to be ashamed of some shameful things. And I think, when I read one Twitter tweet from a well-known pastor saying, I'm glad about the death of civic religion because it's paved the way for reformed hip-hop. One, I was not over familiar with what reformed hip-hop is, but I'd rather not have reformed hip-hop and no pornography in the streets, I think, by and large. I think those who celebrate the death of civic religion really celebrate the arrival of a world that is cruel to our children, if I could put it that way. And that's not to say that civic religion is Christianity, but it is to say that civic religion fulfilled some very useful functions in protecting some very vulnerable people in our society. We want our children to affirm good civic values. I think we can stand shoulder to shoulder with conservatives of all religious stripes on those issues because we share a common love concerning this earthly city. And I think we can do it without compromising our theological convictions about the heavenly city. And I think we must do that because, to be honest, we're too small and inconsequential if we stand alone to make any difference on these things. We can stand shoulder to shoulder, I think, with others on these issues. I also think that there's a connection between politics and the pastoral. How do we address pastoral issues? By the way, this is a shot from one of my favorite TV comedies, Father Ted. Will mean nothing to most Americans, but it was the best comedy ever produced in the history of mankind, as far as I'm concerned. And I just looked up sheep and pastor, and wow, a Father Ted picture popped up. So I'll use that, even though no American will understand what I'm talking about. When we come to things like the LGBTQ movement, I think the tendency is, particularly at a time when this culture war seems so intense, there can be a tendency not to make distinctions that need to be made. And I think the distinction that needs to be made is we need to distinguish political movements and ideologies from the challenges, or from the sin and the challenges faced by individuals. If we don't make that distinction, then one of two things happens. If we don't make that distinction, then our compassion for individuals who are struggling will bleed over into not realizing the danger that comes from the political and ideological movements. Or we fall into the opposite error, that our dislike of the political and ideological movements means that we do not show the right compassion for those who are struggling with these things. Now, don't get me wrong. I want to be very clear. I regard homosexuality as a sin. But it's kind of unique among sins on this level in our current culture in that it's also an identity, which means that the requirement that somebody put to death that sin, which is a New Testament requirement, is going to be far more brutally difficult than putting to death the sin of greed, for example, because nobody identifies as greedy. Greed is something you do. It's not something you are. And I think pastorally, one needs to be very compassionate to the person who is struggling with this stuff, who wants to put the sin to death, but is being told by every message coming from wider society that in putting that sin to death, they are putting themselves to death. They are erasing themselves. Now, I'm not quite sure exactly how that works out in pastoral ministry. And I was a pastor long enough to know that every pastoral situation has its own uniquenesses that make it very difficult to produce this is the formula to follow when this person comes into your study or office with this problem. There's always a unique history. There are always unique dynamics in any situation. But I do think that distinction between the political drive for this stuff and the human beings being damaged by this stuff is very, very important. We need to be ruthless with the politics, ruthless with the sin, incredibly compassionate with the individuals who are being wrecked by it. As I say, that might take a different form in different ways, but I put it this way. We need to be morally firm and personally compassionate. And also, I would suggest community is vital. One of the inferences, I didn't sort of make it explicit, but one of the inferences of my first two lectures is identities comes from community. That we are, in some ways, the people with whom we associate and to whom we are connected. Paul sort of makes that point in Corinthians. He said, bad company corrupts morals. You are the moral sum of the people you associate with. He's essentially saying that. Why was the LGBTQ community so powerful and effective? Because it was a community. We all have a whole variety of different identities. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a son. I'm an employee. I'm a Christian. The most powerful identities I have, though, connect to the most powerful communities or relationships I have. So, yes, I am an employee, but the bottom line is I'm more of a husband than I am an employee. I've moved employer several times during my life, and it's changed me, but it's not changed me in the fundamental way that, were I to leave my wife, perish the thought, that would fundamentally change me. That's a much stronger identity. And that, I think, raises a challenge for the church. The church, we cannot expect people to stand against the cultural hurricane that's hitting us if the church is not the strongest community to which they belong, because that provides people with the strongest identity. And I think that's where we have to think. And don't get me wrong, again, I'm not saying, there's that old, is Christianity believing or belonging? That's a false dichotomy. It's a false opposition. Christianity is believing and belonging. You cannot have one and not the other in the Bible. The Bible knows nothing of Lone Ranger Christians, and it knows nothing of Christians who don't believe something. The two go together. And I think the challenge for churches today is we need to be strong communities. And this might sound odd and counterintuitive, but that's where I would suggest that what's happening to us is, in some sense, it will be wasted if we don't see it as an opportunity. If all we do is lament our marginalization, then we miss the advantages that marginalization gives us. Why did the Jews in Europe end up being so successful? Because they were a marginal group. Why were the Quakers in 19th century Britain so successful? Because they were a marginal group. The history of the English Industrial Revolution is interestingly connected to the history of English nonconformity. Because if you were a nonconformist before the Reform Acts in Britain, in England, You couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, the universities. You couldn't be an MP. You couldn't teach at a university. You couldn't be a civil servant. The only thing you could do was make stuff. And so did they make stuff. The Quakers, the best chocolate in the world, thank God for the Quakers, was developed by the Quakers. Bourneville, Cadbury's. They were marginal, and it made them strong communities. And I want to suggest that as we get marginalized, let's lament it. It's sad that society is repudiating the church in the way it is. But maybe it's an opportunity to become strong communities. Pilgrims and exiles. That's the New Testament model, it seems to me, of the church. The model is one of pilgrimage or exile. Pilgrim, I hate to say, I love John Bunyan, and is the Pilgrim's Progress not one of the greatest works of world literature, let alone Christian literature? I've got a lot of Roman Catholic friends. They love Pilgrim's Progress. I'm saying to them, have you seen what he says about the Pope? He's sitting in that cave gnawing on the bones of the martyrs. Well, yeah, but it's great. It's just such a great story. And these days, actually, most of my Catholic friends aren't big fans of the Pope, actually. But that's another story. Of course, the idea of pilgrim is very much the Bunyan model we often have as evangelical Protestants, and that's the wandering person with no place to lay their hat and call home. That's not entirely, I think, what the New Testament is getting at. That we're not to sort of be itinerants in this world in that sort of sense. We're to be exiles. We are to be living in a land that we don't quite belong to. We're to work for the land that we don't quite belong to. I think Solzhenitsyn is a much better example. Think of Solzhenitsyn. He was brought to the West, first to Switzerland and then later to the United States. And the wonderful thing about Solzhenitsyn, I always love this about him, that he was glad to be in the West and he was glad to be free, but he was no unconditional worshipper of the West. He nailed the problems of the West in the same way that he nailed the problems of communism. And of course, we in the West didn't like him for that. But he's been proved to be very true, I think, in the long run. But the great thing about Solzhenitsyn was, one got the impression he appreciated living in a land of freedom, but he was not going to be uncritical of the land of freedom. And I think that's a good model for Christians. The world always comes up short. We should expect that. We should not despair when that happens, because our hope lies ultimately in the heavenly city. But we are not born into this world merely to twiddle our thumbs until we get to the heavenly city. That's not why we're alive. We are in this world to seek the welfare of the earthly city. And I think that calls upon us to engage as Christian citizens in this earthly city. What might that look like? I have no general answer for you. It's a blank screen. But I would suggest, at a minimum, it looks like local community. I do think that one of the things I know there are a number of British guys in the audience, and there are many great things about being British, particularly about being English, actually. It must be frustrating to be Scottish and to have been so close. And Haddington, it's near the border, and yet you're not quite there. It must be very frustrating to be a Scotsman. But even so, it's not bad. It's like second prize, should we say. Anyway, but one of the interesting things about being an English evangelical is I always assumed the church was marginal. And I always had very modest ambitions for what the church was going to deliver in this life. And I think one of the things that in American Christianity we need to do is to realize that actually, what we're going to get in this life is pretty modest. We get what we can, but it's not going to be that great. So we need to have a modest vision. Secondly, I think it's important to realize, we're not taking over Congress for Jesus anytime soon. It always makes me smile when I read some of this Reconstructionist theonomy stuff online. And I'm thinking, you can't even get us a decent Protestant member of the Supreme Court. How are you going to take over the nation? 32 guys in Idaho or something are going to deliver the nation for us. I just don't see it. I don't see it. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see it. So I think we also need to really limit our ambitions nationally. That's not to say we should give up on politics at all. I just think we need to realize we're now in it for the long haul. It's not going to be turned around in a single election. So that makes me think that where we really need to divert our energies is to the local. Where can you and I really have an impact? Well, you can tweet all day long to people that really you'll ultimately have no influence over at all. Or you can be a good member of your neighborhood. You can be part of the local community. People might think that your views of LGBTQ stuff are crazy and bigoted, but if they see you treating people with kindness in your local community, it will be hard for them to maintain that view. And so my last sort of words are, what's the answer? I think it probably looks different in different places. It's going to look different in rural western Pennsylvania than it does in urban Manhattan and all points in between. But I do think the answer lies in real relationships, in the real world, in real time, involving Christians doing what the Lord tells them to do, and that's being kind and loving. Maybe Jesus should have the last word. By all this will men know that you are my, by this will all men know that you are my disciples, by the love you have for each other. Thanks very much.
A few more books to recommend. Please encourage Josh Serban. He does a wonderful job along with the bookstore team at Emmanuel Baptist Church to find great books at great prices, working with so many publishers. We're not trying to make any profit. We're trying to just break even by getting good books at good prices. First book, Openness Unhindered by Rosaria Butterfield. So Robert mentioned her first book earlier. This is her second book. On page 24, she asked this question: how does one repent of a sin that doesn't feel like a sin at all? She gets right into Carl's point about an entire identity and everything that works around that. Great chapters on things like union in Christ from a confessionally reformed perspective, on repentance. Excellent chapter on repentance. Make a copy of that chapter on repentance. Use it in counseling all the time. Certainly is dealing with issues like sexual orientation and many other issues. What does it mean to be gay? Again, Openness Unhindered by Rosaria Butterfield is in the back. Also Butterfield, The Gospel Comes with a House Key. This is an excellent book on hospitality and on tracing some of the ways that a Christian showed hospitality to her. She closes the book asking a series of questions. Imagine a world where every Christian practiced radically ordinary hospitality, either as a host or a guest. Imagine a world where every Christian made a covenant of church membership and honored it. Imagine a world where every Christian tithed and where they lived intentionally below their means, having enough to share and moving into neighborhoods that need us more often than we need them. Imagine a world where living as image bearers of a holy God meant something that changed the way we saw ourselves and others. Imagine a world where neighbors said that Christians throw the best parties in town and are the go-to people for big problems and issues without being invited. Imagine if the children in the neighborhood knew that the Christians were safe people to ask for help when unthinkable agony canvassed their private or family homes. She goes on just in this conclusion. Imagine this kind of biblical world of hospitality and love. She covers throughout the book on very practical issues of hospitality, the providence of hospitality, lamentation in hospitality. We commend this book to you highly. The Gospel Comes with a House Key. And then finally, Andrew Walker, God and the Transgender Debate. A short, readable, winsome book. Listen to the subtitle. What does the Bible actually say about gender identity? Possibly one of the most helpful parts of this book is in the appendix on dealing with tough questions. As Carl mentioned, this idea of social acceleration. Things happen so fast before we can grasp what's happening. And he wrestles with issues like, can someone be transgender and Christian? How do you speak with children? What should we think of pronoun usage? And other excellent questions in that final chapter. He's trying to walk through a biblical understanding of these issues of sexuality and how we can engage people. There's a whole glossary of terms to try to enter into understanding where people are. Cisgender, heteronormative, gender fluid. He's defining, he's educating, and he's doing it in a winsome way that we can walk with others who are suffering and are working through these issues. It's winsome, it's informative, it's helpful. So go away, read some books, get some books, and come back at 3 o'clock. We will start the Q&A at 3 o'clock.